It's happening right now in America. Bitcoin miners turning off in droves because they can make more money doing AI. And that could play out in a very bad way for the Bitcoin network.
I'm your host, Mags, and you're listening to Magsplaining, where I bring on interesting guests to talk about tech, money, and power shifts. I hope you enjoy this episode. This show is powered by Ledn, the global leader in Bitcoin-backed loans. Visit ledn.io/mags to learn more. I'm so happy to have Russell Cann here. Russell is the Chief Development Officer at CoreSci. Welcome to Magsplaining.
Thanks, Mags. I appreciate you having me.
I feel like you're an expert in hyperscalers and data centers and AI and Bitcoin mining, so I can't wait to pick your brain.
Well, I know just enough to be dangerous about most of those topics. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Could you give us a quick overview of your journey? How did you end up at Core?
So I got involved in cryptocurrency back in 2014. Got involved pretty early on with Ethereum mining. And that particular company, though, got rolled into what became CoreSci early on before CoreSci owned its first property. So the company I brought in, brought in a bunch of GPUs, did the altcoins, Ethereum mining. One of the other founders at Core was involved in Bitcoin mining. I agreed to come in and take over the same role I've been in the whole time, which is strategy, revenue, and growth. And I've been doing that at CoreSci basically since the end of 2017, all the way up until right now. And we'll see how far along that goes. As you know, there's a lot of changes coming up at CoreSci over the next couple of months.
Yeah.
I should say possible.
Core's transition primarily from mining to AI infrastructure is completely notable, especially with the recent potential proposed merger, CoreWeave, right? So what marked this big transition from going from mining into AI infrastructure? And how does that align with these broader power shifts that you're seeing in the tech sector?
So one of the interesting things at CoreSci and at CoreWeave for that matter, GPUs in the world of AI is not necessarily new to either CoreSci or our client CoreWeave, which we're in a possible acquisition phase, depending on when this recording hits the internet. At CoreSci, we started getting involved, as I just mentioned, with GPUs very early on for Ethereum mining. And the same situation happened actually over at CoreWeave. So in 2018, 2019, I met Mike Intrada and Brian Ventura, two of the three co-founders over at CoreWeave, before it was called CoreWeave. We met at NVIDIA because we had both, as CoreSci and then as they were called Atlantic Crypto at the time, were very large GPU process. We had a large GPU fleet, each of us did. And CoreSci, or what we eventually called CoreSci, we started hosting Atlantic Crypto's GPUs, and we hosted a huge chunk of their fleet all the way through the very end of 2022. So we hosted a big piece of their fleet all the way up until Ethereum went to proof of stake. At that point, CoreWeave transitioned into the world of AI. But let me back up a minute. CoreSci also, in summer 2019, we implemented the first DGX-ready data center in North America. So we worked with NVIDIA to develop a DGX-ready data center. And oddly enough, we actually started doing what CoreWeave does now, and what a lot of folks do now, which is sell GPUs by the hour, GPUs as a service, compute as a service. CoreSci did that up until our Chapter 11 process. When we went into Chapter 11, we had to hyper-focus on where the majority of our revenue was coming from, which was Bitcoin mining. So we actually sold that business off to AMD. Just before we went into Chapter 11, we sold that business off. So to say it was something we just kind of woke up and thought about doing, or something we just stepped into, is really, and some people think that's the case, but it's really something we've been dancing with for a long time. So our client, CoreWeave, came to us while we were in Chapter 11 and said, look, we need a lot of power and a lot of space for GPUs, and you guys have it. So we negotiated that deal, with Mike and Brian over at CoreWeave, and then everything's become public since then. Everything's kind of knows. We cut a very large deal with them, and at this point, as we sit here today, we're in an acquisition process that very well could happen. It's going to be up to CoreSci's shareholders, which just recently that vote's going to happen in the month of October. So probably when this thing is hitting the web. but it'll be up to Core Scientific shareholders to vote on that, and we could become, part of CoreWeave, which would be apropos. I mean, we're already a large chunk of CoreWeave's infrastructure. They're a big chunk of our revenue. They're almost all of it, to be honest, right now, and that's by design and on purpose. About 2,000 megawatts of electrical infrastructure in place. We have about 1,200, 1,300 megawatts, maybe 1,400 megawatts of power purchase agreements in place, and CoreWeave is almost half of that. So they are a big chunk of our current contract revenue, and they're absolutely all of our current GPUs that are going to be turned on this year. So this year, I think we're planning on turning on at our sites about 200,000 GB200s across multiple sites, and that will be for CoreWeave. Ultimately, CoreWeave has announced their end clients are NVIDIA and I think Google and OpenAI at our largest site in Denton. But ultimately, that'll be 200,000 GPUs. I don't know that anyone else in the world is going to be turning on that many GPUs in this period of time. So it's pretty amazing to have seen that happen over a very short period of time.
Yeah, and as part of the strategic advantage was the amount of power that Core Scientific had access to.
So, and that's a large piece of it. Yeah, there's a couple of different pieces. Core Scientific has the power purchase agreements in place. We own the electrical infrastructure for the most part. That's very important when it comes to redundancy. So at Core Scientific, we built from the substation on down at most of our sites. And owning the substation and being the only user on a substation helps with the redundancy, because if you have multiple users on a substation, you can't control what that other user does to that substation. So say, Mags, you were operating a manufacturing facility on a substation that I had a data center on, you could do something at your manufacturing facility that sends harmonics back up and into the substation and causes problems. And therefore, when you share a substation, it creates redundancy issues, which creates the need for a lot more physical redundancy at a data center, such as generators and batteries. But if you own a substation, you cut down on some of that risk to actually the substation getting messed up by another user. So anyway, at Core Scientific, we own a lot of infrastructure, which has a lot of value. We have PPAs in place, which has a lot of value. And then for other reasons, just because of our own background as staff at Core, we overbuilt a lot of the fiber for what was needed for Bitcoin mining, but we built the perfect amount of fiber, which is needed for a HPC data center. So let's take Marble, North Carolina, for instance, which is a beautiful little site in a valley in western North Carolina. We actually brought in a lot of fiber to that little facility, way more than was ever needed for Bitcoin mining, but it's the perfect amount needed for HPC. So that site right now, by the end of this year, is going to be an NVIDIA supercomputer for NVIDIA, which is pretty amazing. That site was a former thread factory built about 70 years ago. Almost a decade ago now, Core Scientific took over what was an abandoned building, turned it into what at the time became the largest Bitcoin mining site in North America. And now it's going to be a supercomputer for NVIDIA, which is incredible, because if you go to that site right now, there's twice as many contractors working at that site as there are population in the little town that it occupies. So it's pretty amazing. But I say all that to say, yes, it's the PPAs, it's the electrical infrastructure, and then probably most importantly is it was the staff. Interesting enough, at Core Scientific, we were a bunch of data center people that got into Bitcoin mining, and that combination meant that you had a lot of folks with technical skills in the data center world. But then when you dive into Bitcoin mining, you learn to iterate very quickly. You learn to engineer and iterate, because Bitcoin mining changes every 10 minutes. And your revenue's cut in half every 4 years. And that just means you're always trying to improve, and you're always trying to make your sites better, your engineering better, your software better. And that iterative engineering, that speed of Bitcoin is now in play again in the world of AI. And of course, CoreSci, we took data center people, traditional data center people, we made them Bitcoin people, and it made them very good at being AI people, or I guess should say very good at being AI infrastructure people. Just because of the speed, right? AI is the only thing in my career, and I've been doing this now for many decades. AI is the only thing that's moving faster than Bitcoin, if I could say that. And I didn't think anything ever would move as fast as Bitcoin does. But AI is iterating faster than Bitcoin, and it's amazing to watch.
That's cool to hear about the original roots and how that's building the current company that you have today. So back to CoreWeave, they've sort of been a cornerstone of company's journey. Can you talk about the deal and the structure? Pros, cons? I know there's some criticisms too. I'm
Yeah.
just curious, hearing it from you.
So, there's good and bad. This is actually a good deal for both companies. Core Scientific was in Chapter 11 when this deal was negotiated and just coming out of Chapter 11, so had a very real credit problem coming out of Chapter 11. CoreWeave had a lot of revenue and a lot of cash, but they were a private company. So they had a private company, no matter how big you are, has a credit problem. So the way we solved for that credit problem was CoreWeave took on the build risk as far as the cost. Core Scientific had the people, we had the supply chain, we had the sites, we had the PPAs. Coming out of Chapter 11, though, we did not have the credit to take on large build projects. CoreWeave, from a credit profile as a private entity, was very difficult for us to go and finance as well. So the way we worked that was we actually lowered our revenue number a good bit off what market was, but CoreWeave said they would take on the capital infrastructure costs. So we provided the sites, they put the capital into the sites. And what that turned into was, CoreWeave is investing in our sites, and ultimately it made it a very apropos for them to acquire us as a company, or for them to acquire Core Scientific as a company after they went public. After they went public, they've since, of course, signed some monster agreements. I think last saw they have over $30 billion in back orders as far as contracted revenue coming up. So CoreWeave's credit issues have been solved at this point. But from the contract perspective, I don't think that contract will ever be done again by anybody. Core Scientific wouldn't do that contract again because we would actually prefer more revenue and higher margins. CoreWeave would not do that contract again because they now have enough credit themselves that they would expect their providers to provide the CapEx and provide the capital, take on those risks. So I don't think either company would do the deal again today, but I think when we did the deal, it was great for both companies, which is a good thing. It's kind of interesting to come out of agreement that large, a $10 billion agreement. And I think both sides, I'd put my hat on as Core Scientific or CoreWeave and say at the time, I would probably do that deal again.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think anyone is ever going to do a deal like that again. Just because we were in such a unique situation coming out of Chapter 11, and they were in such a unique situation. You got to realize in 2022, they did about $25 million in revenue. In 2024, they did right at $2 billion in revenue. I think they just said they're going to have $5 billion in revenue this year. So they've had some incredible revenue growth, and gone public during that period of time. We've come out of Chapter 11 and did a complete turnaround during that time. So again, I think it was a situational awareness created that deal, and it was a game changer for CoreWeave, and it was a game changer for Core Scientific. I also think it was a game changer for Bitcoin miners. I think Bitcoin miners across, at least in the U.S., looked and said, "Wait a minute, do we have something here that can have real value in the AI space?" And at the time, you got to go back. I think Bitcoin mining in America, and it's still overbuilt in my opinion. You're looking at 1,000 exahash of hash rate on the Bitcoin. When I first started, all of Bitcoin mining would fit in one or two sites today. So it's amazing how much Bitcoin mining has gotten so large in the U.S. But specifically in the U.S., in my opinion, there's a higher and better use of some of that data center infrastructure, and not necessarily Bitcoin mining, but in the world of AI. And I think the CoreWeave CoreSci deal kind of opened some eyes for a lot of our fellow Bitcoin miners, saying, "Wait a minute, maybe in the U.S. there's some different uses of our infrastructure." Now, different Bitcoin miners are chasing it different ways. Some are trying to own GPUs and be a neo cloud or a small cloud provider and sell GPUs as a service. Some are following the Core Scientific example and becoming a data center operator and saying, "Hey, we're just going to sell rack space." There's pros and cons to each of those business models, and I think different folks are taking it differently, just depending on what their experience are and what contracts they can land in their hand. If a hyperscaler shows up and says, "I'll lease 100 megawatts of your space," you say yes. If a neocloud shows up, or if an enterprise client shows up and says, "I want to rent 10,000 GPUs from you," you say yes. And I think in many situations, that's where folks have made a decision based on what kind of contracted revenue they could get in their hands.
So, I'm seeing NVIDIA and OpenAI partnerships. There's Google taking a stake in Cypher mining, right? And of course, there's your proposed merger. Can you summarize what is happening in the hyperscaler space?
Yeah. So effectively, AI demand is absolutely through the roof. And what I mean by that is end user demand. Inference demand is absolutely through the roof. Lots of folks are using ChatGPT, Anthropic, Grok. They're using them as a retail user, but more importantly, they use them at the corporate level as a corporate user. I think corporations are finding maybe not necessarily AI as a replacement for humans, but they're certainly finding that AI can um, augment functionality for a lot of their folks. It's first started out with programmers, but you're seeing it now in the world of HR, in the world of accounting and finance, where AI is making people more productive. And in some cases, and lots of cases, actually, I think it's making people more productive and more enjoying their jobs more, because if it's something that was redundant, you're able to put that into an AI and have it do that. Like, I hate making PowerPoint presentations. I suck at it. But you can dump those into a AI and it makes the PowerPoint presentation, then that's fantastic, right? It's something I hate doing, but I have to do in my job. So it really makes me more productive because I can spend less time doing something I don't like doing. And I think in the world of AI, we're seeing a lot of that demand. Now, opposite of that, though, is how much very, very large scale demand is there. And what I mean by that is how much demand is there for a 1 gigawatt or a 2 gigawatt or a 5 gigawatt site. I personally think that demand for those very, very large sites is much, much smaller than people think. I think Sam Altman and OpenAI wants a very, very large site because I think he believes, and OpenAI believes, that with large language models, you can eventually get to AGI. And they're chasing these very large sites. And I think because they're the people up front, the blockers for them were basically Microsoft and now Oracle. The world sees more very, very large site demand than what actually exists. Now, the saving grace, though, is that there's so much inference demand that comes after that, that if people are building very large sites for 1 or 2 gigawatts, they will get absorbed just because the inference demand is out there. But again, I don't think there's so much demand for gigawatts and 2 gigawatts and 3 gigawatts and 7 gigawatt sites as there is for inference load. And that inference load can be at the 20 megawatt level, but it can also be at the 1,000 megawatt level. But I do think we're seeing unprecedented demand. I think it's going to continue to grow. I think user demand is going to continue to grow. AI demand is going to is easy to put a revenue dollar on. I think we're seeing AI growth faster than internet growth as far as dollars go. So I think it's easy to say, hey, these users are going to pay me $30 a user per month, or $100 a user per month, or $10,000 a user per month, depending on the quality of the agentic AI that's being used and quality of the inference load. So I think the demand is there. I think the supply is not necessarily there, but I think the world is working very hard to deliver that supply. But I think if you go back to the CoreWeave and the CoreSci deal, I think Brian kind of saw the future and saw just how scarce power generation is going to be in certain markets, and he wanted to suck up some of that power generation. I would probably talk about power generation and power and AI use.
Yep.
I think AI is going to suck up a lot of the world's power generation, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because you got to think about it this way, Mags. That's just like in Bitcoin mining, that's dollars invested in the grid.
Yeah.
Bitcoin mining was able to take and use underutilized assets where somebody had already invested dollars in a specific area of the grid, and they weren't getting a return. So Bitcoin miners went there. Were able to take cheap power and create a very low variable cost to operate, but it was able to use underutilized infrastructure that's already in place. AI demand is so high and there's so much money being invested that for the first time since the end of World War II, the whole globe is looking at investing in the utility grid. We haven't done that. We haven't done that in 70 years. We certainly haven't done it in America since the 50s, 1950s, when we had a large manufacturing base. In the rest of the world, did not do it until since the end of World War II, when the world had to rebuild after that dramatic event. But I think we're seeing new infrastructure come online. And what's great about that new infrastructure is it's going to be more energy efficient. It's going to be a more efficient system. We're talking new transmission, new substations, new transformers, new generation. When you build new generation, it's going to be nuclear. It's going to be small modular reactors. It's going to be solar and batteries. It's going to be wind and batteries, because you're going to try to go to places where you're going to have the lowest cost variable power. And as much as we're going to, in the U.S., use nat gas plants for a while because they're very fast to get online, you're not going to see new coal plants coming online in America because coal just costs too much to burn. it's just too expensive compared to nuclear, or compared to SMRs, or compared to wind and batteries, or compared to hydro. Now, you're not going to see new hydro come online, because even though hydro has a zero variable cost, it has a tremendous amount of cost to actually put in place, because the last time we had huge amounts of hydro, governments just came in and kind of took land and said, all right, we're going to make a big lake here and dam it up. It's harder to do that now, except for in Western China. But but it's one of those things that we're seeing investment in the grid, and that investment in the grid, I think, is for AI, but I think the whole planet is going to actually benefit from it. So that's my opinion.
Looking into the future, right? How do you envision this distribution of power? We have the Mag 7 right now. Do you see that remaining, where the Mag 7 are heavily involved, except for Apple, and we don't know where they're going with the AI? Do you see them dominating, and do you continue to see this centralization, or do you think it's going to shift?
So, well, there will be a lot of centralization. However, it's not going to be, in my opinion, it's not going to be as prevalent as it has been, because you have companies like OpenAI that are coming in very, very hard in this space. You have companies like Anthropic that are coming in very hard. Your biggest AI operators are not your Mag 7. Well, I guess Gemini, you say Google, Gemini's somewhere in the rank there. But your largest GPU as a provider service, your clouds, are like your CoreWeaves. And then way after that, you're going to have your Nebuses and Lambdas and all that. They're way below the CoreWeave. But you do have this whole generation of GPU as a service cloud providers that are coming in, and they are beating the socks off of Azure and Google and AWS when it comes to providing GPUs to the AI market. And that's because Azure and Amazon Web Services and Google, they were very slow on bringing new data center online, because data center growth was very predictable for decades. So they kept up with the growth, but did not have reason to really go outside of that predicted growth. And the world of GPU demand for AI was just coming to those Mag 7 sideways. And it created the opening for companies like CoreWeave to come in and really dominate that space. So I think we're going to continue to see some dominance. It's going to be a while, though, before Microsoft and Google and AWS get into the GPU space. But by then, you're also going to have a whole new slew of providers that are not small, like your CoreWeaves, that are also going to be new cloud operators. And the biggest company on the planet, NVIDIA, is betting on that, and betting on that hard. As we see here today, NVIDIA is betting on and investing in these new cloud companies like CoreWeave and Lambda. And they're putting dollars in there to say, hey, we want these cloud operators because they can move faster than Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, or Google when it comes to bringing new infrastructure online. Your traditional cloud, your big three traditional cloud folks, they still move at the same speed. Now, Meta's a different animal.
Yeah.
Meta moves very quickly and makes decisions almost like a startup when it comes to their infrastructure. Meta, much like OpenAI, much like CoreWeave, can make decisions on, say, hey, we don't need to necessarily have gensets on all of our GPUs, because we know we don't necessarily need gensets on all our GPUs. So Meta's a different animal when it comes to infrastructure. I think it's because Mark Zuckerberg over there kind of controls that whole company, so he's able to say, hey, move forward on this thing very quickly. But the others do tend to be more methodical about their design. And that's just because they always have been, and I think they will be for a while. So again, I think the Mag 7 aren't going anywhere. I think they're going to have plenty of their own data center infrastructure, but I do think there's going to be new players come in. And of course, it's not miss this, like Oracle is not necessarily a small company by any means. It's one of the largest technical companies on the planet, but they're new to the cloud space, right? And they're using their balance sheet to fund effectively OpenAI's growth. And they're stepping in as a credit partner for OpenAI, and OpenAI's revenue growth, though, is what Oracle sees as a primary driver for them. So when you have companies like Oracle coming in saying, we're going to be the credit provider for an OpenAI, it's almost de facto, one of the largest companies on the planet anyways. So I guess I talked around that. So when we get to the end, the Mag 7 is still going to be around. They're still going to have large data center infrastructure. There's a lot of new players that are also going to be big. There's room for all of them in this game. So
because of this massive growth, right, and all this investment, occasionally I do see those headlines, just like, Bitcoin is dead, that that there's going to be like this big bust cycle in AI, that it's a bubble, right? Where do you sit on this? Do you think we're going to see these kind of like boom bust, bear, bull markets in AI infrastructure, or not anytime soon?
I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon, but I do think if you're not careful, you could be stuck with a site where you have hopes and dreams of building a 7 gigawatt data center, and then you come back and there's no one for your 7 gigawatt data center. So, so my advice there, or at least my thought process there, is folks that are developing data centers need to be careful. But there is years worth of demand there that's just built up. But you don't need to be looking out 10 years and saying I'm going to do something. You need to be thinking the next 2 or 3 or 4 years on where your demand's going to be. In the world of Bitcoin, I don't think it's going anywhere.
From an energy security perspective, right, we have talked about Bitcoin mining, including Bitcoin mining provides energy security, which is part of the national security conversation. How do you see national security and AI playing out?
I think national security and AI are fundamentally tied to each other, probably not necessarily for the good.
Mhm.
You know, kind of scary. We're seeing it play out in Ukraine right now, where drones and AI are. We're seeing how it can play out into the bad in as far as war goes. I do think fundamentally it can be a positive thing, but from the world of national security, I think every sovereign in every country is going to want control of its own AI, whether it's to control its people, which is a bad thing, or if it's to control new science and new healthcare and new discoveries, which can be a good thing. So I do think that from a sovereign perspective, each country or each region is going to be, and when I say region, I mean Europe, because Europe in general tends to be looking at AI as a European sovereignty thing, not necessarily an individual country thing. But I think each region of the world is going to be looking at AI as a fundamental need for national security to have compute because of the economic drivers of AI, the science drivers of AI, the war drivers of AI. I think all those things are going to be super important. As far as how it's tied into the grid, I think it's going to be, again, it's going to be a positive thing. Much like Bitcoin mining is good for the grid in that you can have curtailments. I think we're going to get a little bit further out in the way AI data centers are going to convince utility providers to let them operate, is that they're going to build redundant generation on site. And the utility grid is going to say, look, you're building a 300 megawatt data center, and I need you to build 300 megawatts of nat gas generation on site to back it up. I want use of that 300 megawatts of generation whenever you're not needing it for redundancy. So if you think about the fact that almost all these AI data centers are actually building their same generation just for redundancy, we're talking for like 4 or 5 or 10 hours a year. I think and when it's not needed, it could be used to actually create generation that's used by the grid. I think we're going to see a lot more integration that way as we get out into the future, because utility grid operators are going to look and say, look, I will connect you to the grid. I'll give you 300 megawatts. But when you build that redundancy and you're building out your own 300 megawatts generation as redundancy, I want access to 100 of it, 90% of the time or something like that. So
Mhm.
I think we're going to see a fundamental shift on the way AI data centers interact with the grid. And we already saw that shift with Bitcoin mining. It's not that Bitcoin miners built generation, but Bitcoin miners went in and had a fundamental handshake with utility grids that said, you can control our site. ERCOT controls Core Scientific's Pecos site. Now, we built the software. They didn't. They didn't have that skill set. We built the software, but ERCOT can turn off our Pecos site whenever it needs to, and it does. When there's big winter storms or it's hot, they can turn it off. They can bring it back down again, and they have access to our software to turn our sites off. Well, that fundamental handshake meant that it's what made Bitcoin mining explode in Texas. Bitcoin miners said, hey, we can work with the grid. And I think what we're going to see, it's going to be a different solution, but we're going to see that fundamental handshake that's going to happen between AI data center developers and utility grid operators. But it's going to be around the world of redundancy and how much batteries and how much generation, because if an AI data center operator is building 300 megawatts of batteries, even if it's a 10 or 15-minute cycle, and they're building 300 megawatts of gensets on site, that's a lot of damn generation. It's a lot of damn cost, and it's just sitting there unused for most of the time. So I think once AI data center operators and grid utilities figure out what that solution is going to look like or what that handshake is going to look like, I think we're going to see an explosion of growth, because once that fundamental solution is in place, it will help solve a lot of the problems that we're currently experiencing right now.
We hear a lot about Mag 7 building as well as the AI companies. But are sovereigns also building out their own data centers? We don't hear much of that. Is it more because of a national security issue and so they don't want to disclose it?
So, and a lot of cases, the Mag 7 are actually doing the building. There's
Hmm.
people building data centers. They're coming in buying or leasing sites, but it's the same with sovereigns. A lot of sovereigns, they have a huge demand. They're not necessarily building out the sites themselves, but they're contracting with people to come in and build sites and saying, hey, we'll give you the land, we'll give you the power, but we need you to build a site for us. And some of them do talk about it. So if you look at the amount of GPU that the United States consumes, it's a ton. That's just like any other sovereign as well. And the more and more AI is used in science and healthcare, and particularly Department of Defense and war, you're going to see a more and more sovereign compute come online.
Hmm.
Whether they talk about it or not, it's still there.
And speaking on sovereignty element, how does data sovereignty play into all these geopolitical challenges?
I would be scared personally. Your personal data is going to get, and if you think it's used now, let AI get into it, and your personal data. Some of it we're going to probably, at least in America, we're going to buy it hook, line, and sinker. Everybody wants their Meta glasses, and they want them to work, and they want the advertisement for whatever crap they want to buy from Amazon. So it's funny to me that we will give up for convenience. At least in the U.S., consumers will give up a lot of their personal data just for convenience. They do it every day with the TV shows they watch. They want YouTube to tell them what they want to watch. They want Facebook to tell them what they want to look at. They want Instagram and they want TikTok to tell them what they want to look at. So they will give up sovereign data. The world of AI is going to it's going to be so good at taking your data and feeding you the content you want to see. I think a lot of users are going to give up more sovereignty than they really should. That's just my personal opinion. They're going to do it in the name of convenience and marketing, which is sad, but it's going to happen. So, and then in the world of, at least happening in the United States, in the world of security, we're going to give up a lot of personal rights as far as, cameras and all that kind of stuff and watching us 24/7, 365. And people are going to say, no, I'd rather be secure and maybe watch 24/7. So again, people for personal reasons are going to give up a lot of their own data privacy and security in the name of convenience and their own physical security, I guess. So.
Yeah. Should people be concerned about sort of where the data center sits?
Not so much where the data center sits, but where the data sits. Where
Okay.
the data center itself is physically located, that's not a huge
Sorry, I
concern.
meant I meant the jurisdiction under which.
Where your data sits, I would be very concerned about that. Who has control of that data? It could be a very scary thing. Who has control? And I'm sitting here thinking like, look at Palantir, which is a great company if you're an investor. But like, look at their involvement with the U.S., with law enforcement, with everything like that. That's very scary. So who has that data and who has access to that data is a very scary thing. And again, though, I think if you look at terms and conditions, most people go into a website or shopping or whatever, and they would just click and give up. Yep, you can have all my data. Go ahead. You can have everything. You can monitor everything I buy. You can monitor how I buy. You can monitor everything I watch. I mean, just click, 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 click. We just go right through that. So it's a very scary thing. And I think it's just going to become more and more of that, because it's always been all that data. A lot of cases, all that data has been there, but corporations have not been able to access all that data or fundamentally process all that data. AI is going to change all of that. AI can actually process all the data. We crossed the threshold several years ago where humans created more data every day than we could consume. But AI will be able to consume and bubble up to the top what data people want to be able to use for certain things. And again, some of it's going to be things that we want. I want a drone from Amazon to drop off shit whenever I order it from my app. I'd love it to be here in 2 hours. Humans are willing to give up a lot of that data and a lot of that data sovereignty just for physical security and for convenience.
Yeah.
Sadly, but it's true.
Wish you could access cash without selling Bitcoin? Ledn makes that possible. The global leader in Bitcoin-backed lending, Ledn has issued over 9 billion loans since 2018 and has a perfect record of protecting client assets. Why is a Ledn loan different? With custodied loans, collateral is not lent out to generate interest. There's no credit checks, funds in less than 6 hours, and there's no monthly payments, so you can repay whenever you want with 0 penalties. And proof of reserves reports verified by a top accounting firm are published every 6 months. Ledn gives Bitcoin holders a secure, transparent way to unlock liquidity without selling. Learn more at ledn.io/megs. That's ledn.io.
I will say this in the world of Bitcoin, I am worried about the more mainstream Bitcoin gets. I do think things like we need to be funding Bitcoin core development. We need to be funding Bitcoin security. If you're a Bitcoiner, you need to be thinking about how are we going to create fees for Bitcoin miners? Because you do need to keep the hash price at least high enough that you have miners on play. And it's never been the case where you might have miners that are turning off, but we're at a point now where you can have miners turning off that have a lot of Bitcoin infrastructure in play that could create a negative environment for Bitcoin. So I think there's things that, as Bitcoin becomes more mainstream and there's more dollars invested in Bitcoin, like with your strategies and your DATs and all that, I think all those players really need to think hard about investing in traditional Bitcoin infrastructure, i.e. Bitcoin core development and Bitcoin security, software security, I mean, and also thinking about how do we need to make sure that we do take care of Bitcoin miners and that we do keep the hash price at least high enough that Bitcoin miners don't turn off in droves. It's happening right now in America. Bitcoin mining is turning off in droves because they can make more money doing AI. And that could play out in a very bad way for the Bitcoin network. And if as the Bitcoin becomes more mainstream and trillions of dollars get invested in Bitcoin, I do think that very base of Bitcoin needs to be looked at. And I say that I put my orange pill hat on, right? I'm saying that I'm one of those guys that are fully in the AI, but I'm a big believer in Bitcoin. I'm also a big believer in Ethereum. I told you I was an Ethereum miner to start with, but I do think that infrastructure needs to be looked at. And I do think where you have these large MicroStrategies and DATs out there that are investing, they need to also think about even just a tiny sliver can go over here to investing in Bitcoin core development, investing in making sure there's some fees coming off on Bitcoin miners,
Yeah.
just to keep that hash price high enough that you keep Bitcoin miners moving in the right direction, because you don't want to see that infrastructure become a negative. You want to keep that infrastructure in a positive way. And it's part of what makes Bitcoin so great is all that compute that it has. I mean, there's over 1,000 exahash of compute, which is unreal. And you want to keep all that online and you want to keep that network secure. So I do think those things need to be thought about when you're having the conversation of how much Bitcoin infrastructure is converting to AI. We need to think about how do we make sure that Bitcoin infrastructure continues to be supported. And as Bitcoin becomes more mainstream, those mainstream adopters understand the importance of the underlying infrastructure. Bitcoin is not a shit coin where it's just a token that someone created. Like, it actually has infrastructure behind it. And I think the world needs to understand it. There's a huge difference between the infrastructure and the compute and the power behind Bitcoin versus just some token some kid created and all of a sudden went public with it. And then it's got a $7 trillion valuation, but there's absolutely nothing you can do with it. Like, I think people need to understand the fundamental differences there. Sorry, I can go on a rant sometimes.
No. Whose role is it to fund, whether it's making sure that there's mining security hitting the network, or even core developers, right? Do you think it will be sovereigns if reserves get much more mainstream, or do you think MicroStrategy or BlackRock are going to start mining?
I don't know if MicroStrategy or BlackRock are not going to start mining, but I do think those folks at MicroStrategy and at Strategy or at BlackRock, they need to understand the importance of the mining infrastructure, just like they need to understand the importance of the Bitcoin core developers. And I think they need to understand that, Bitcoin core developers are there for the security of the network. They're not there to change Bitcoin. They're there just to make sure it stays status quo. And I think for those who just think Bitcoin appears out of nowhere, I think those folks, especially if they're investing billions or trillions of dollars in their Bitcoin itself, they need to understand the underlying fundamentals of how Bitcoin works. So I don't know who's responsible for paying for it. I used to think miners needed to be big, needed to play a large role there.
Yeah.
But that was because miners used to be the biggest economic players in the world of Bitcoin infrastructure. Now they're not. The ETFs are huge, the strategies, the DATs. If you're a Bitcoin treasury company, it blows my mind. If you have a huge Bitcoin treasury, it'd blow my mind that you don't have 2 or 3 core developers on your staff that then report into the core development team. Look, I don't know why you would have all that Bitcoin if you didn't, because I would want a core developer just to keep me informed of what the network's going on the network, right? If CoreSci had not gone into the world of AI, we would be funding core developers right now. We were pushing it very hard. Most of our infrastructure is now AI. But if you have a big Bitcoin hoard on your balance sheet, you got 10,000, 50,000 Bitcoin, 100,000 Bitcoin, you need to seriously be thinking, in my opinion, 2 things. I need to be funding the Bitcoin core network and our core developer network, and I need to have a fundamental understanding of how mining works and what hash price is. And I need to have a fundamental understanding of fees on the Bitcoin network and how that affects hash price. because hash price is going to affect the security of the network. Because if hash price goes down and Bitcoin network starts getting turned off, but you have a machine sitting on the sideline, or worse yet, you have sites sitting on the sideline, that could be very dangerous for the Bitcoin network as far as security goes. So I think outside of Bitcoin miners and outside of the very early core developers, I think folks are just now getting involved in betting lots and lots of money on it, need to have a fundamental understanding of how those roles work. And they need to fund them. They need to fund those things in order to keep the Bitcoin network secure. And I say all that as a guy who's, dived headfirst into AI, but I'm still a believer in Bitcoin. So I'm not going to talk about my shares, but my wallet.
No,
I'm a big believer in Bitcoin. And I think those things need to be addressed.
you raised some really good points. And it's challenging because on the one hand, you have ETFs and DATs sucking up Bitcoin supply and just hodling it. So you're not getting those transactions. Which influences hash price. And then on the other hand, there's always going to be those loud critics that are saying, oh, Bitcoin's been captured, MicroStrategy and all the other big corporations are controlling core developers. It's a really tough one to try to figure out ways that where they're not seen or perceived to be influencing.
But they're not controlling core developers. None of them are funding any core developers. The number of core developers they're funding is diminished. They don't. I mean, they just don't. Like, they're not.
Yeah.
Strategy's not funding a bunch of core developers. I mean, Dorsey does.
Yeah.
Block does. Block's, but not many.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's a really good point.
Yeah. Not many at all, really, to be honest with you. So there's no big ETFs funding core developers. There's no big corporations funding core developers. It used to be core developers and miners and folks with lots of Bitcoin were the same people, but that's changed a long time ago because those guys that had a lot of money now living on an island and don't want to be known. So like those folks are not on the core development team anymore. They might tweet about, software programming, and they might tweet about programming, but they haven't actually done anything on the Bitcoin core in a long time. So no, I don't think right now we're not in a place where Bitcoin needs to worry that corporate America is taking over Bitcoin core development, because that is the farthest thing from the truth.
Yeah. Started with Bitcoin mining, right? Being the pioneer species and building out infrastructure. And now we're seeing AI continue. Bitcoin walks so AI could run. So your work sits at this convergence of Bitcoin mining, AI infrastructure, and energy systems. Can you talk about that interplay a little bit more?
Yeah. So, when we first let's just go back a couple of years. When we first cut this deal with CoreWeave, we actually peeled some of our sites off and said, look, we think these sites are going to be better Bitcoin mining sites than AI sites. And we had certain criteria for that. Some of that criteria was latency to large markets. So we said, look, our site in West Texas, let's take our Pecos site. We said, look, it's just too far from Dallas. It's too far from Houston. There's too much latency there. It's probably not going to ever be a big AI site. We're going to keep that site for mining. We made the same decision about Grand Forks. We made the same decision about our Calvert City, Kentucky site. Since that time, though, we've gone back and re-looked at our Bitcoin mining sites in America and said, actually, every single one of our Bitcoin mining sites in America will make great AI sites. But I will say, if you are a Bitcoin miner, you have to look at your fleet and you have to decide which one's the highest and best use for a site. If you have a site in the jungle in Paraguay, it's probably not going to be an AI site ever. It's probably going to stay a Bitcoin mining site for a very, very long time. If you have a Bitcoin mining site in Dallas, Fort Worth, i.e. our Denton site, it's going to become an AI site because it's too close to a very large market for inference load for AI and for agentic AI. So I think for Bitcoin miners, they're looking at their fleets and they're looking at their sizes going, what works for us? And there's Bitcoin miners that I thought would never not be Bitcoin miners. Bitfarms is one. They were actually mining longer than Core was, which is unusual. I think they're the only one. But Bitfarms has said, what, these sites here for us are going to make good AI sites, so we're going to make them AI sites. So Bitcoin miners have to look and say, okay, if we have a site, does it work for AI? And if it does, you're probably going to say, I'm going to move it to AI. If it doesn't, you're going to say, I'm going to double down or triple down, and it's going to be a long-term Bitcoin site. And you have to understand, operate two different ways. And you know this, but some of your listeners, Bitcoin mining for the utility grid, for instance, is a user of last resort and is a curtailable power. So a Bitcoin miner can use intermittent power load, whereas an AI operator cannot have that intermittent load. at least not at the chip. Now, that intermittent load can come into the data center. So you, the utility provider, can say, hey, Russell, I'm going to curtail you for 100 hours a year. But I can solve that as a data center operator. I can solve that with on-site generation and on-site batteries that serve the GPUs. So I have to solve for that intermittent load. Whereas in Bitcoin mining, you don't really solve for intermittent load. You just turn off your Bitcoin miners. So you, the utility provider, say, look, I'm going to curtail you for 500 hours a year. I just know for 500 hours a year, I'm not going to Bitcoin mine. Whereas in the world of AI, if you tell me I'm going to curtail you for 500 hours a year, I have to then in turn say, okay, I need to build, however large my site is, I need to build that much generation on site, or I need to build that many batteries, or I need to build some kind of redundancy so that if my site, depending on what I'm doing, if my site needs that full load, I need to be able to provide it. Now, with that said, AI operators have learned or are learning quickly that if you know what your hardware is and you know what your software is and you know what your use case is, you don't necessarily have to have all the redundancy because, for instance, large language models, they can be trained, and you could freeze that training, you could put it into storage, and you could turn your site off for 10 minutes or 10 hours. And then when you have your power again, if you're doing a large language model, you can ramp it back up. And interesting enough, for inference loads, if you are a multi-site operator, inference loads operate a lot like Bitcoin mining or Ethereum mining, which means I have an inbound request. And if one site's down, I can send that inference load somewhere else, which is interesting. And that's part of the reason why you see companies like CoreWeave that used to be Ethereum miners, of CoreSci, which we were heavily involved in Ethereum and heavily involved in Bitcoin. We get that. We get that very quickly. It says, you know what? I'm good with turning off that data center over there because I'm going to send all my load over here to this other data center. It makes a whole lot of sense, which is why at CoreSci we call it application-specific data centers, because we know what the hardware is, we know what the application use is, and we design that data center around that application, around that use, just like we design a data center around Bitcoin mining and make it very efficient just for Bitcoin mining. So
You perfectly led into my next question, because we are seeing these data center power shifts, and AI is so power hungry. I'm hearing it's expected to double by 2030. For all I know, the stats have changed since I last read that stat, right? And they do compete directly with Bitcoin miners. So do you see this coexistence, or do you see them shifting towards the edges? Like, where are Bitcoin miners going to thrive when AI can outcompete in terms of the amount of capital being dumped into it?
yeah, so in the United States, I think AI is going to thrive, and I think Bitcoin miners are going to be pushed to the edge. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a Bitcoin miner is going to be pushed out of America. Matter of fact, there's still going to be great sites for Bitcoin mining in America, but it's going to be around what the generation is and around where the utility grid is and around where transmission is versus generation. If you have generation and you have transmission redundancy and generation redundancy, that site's probably going to be AI. If you have generation where someone's overbuilt a wind farm, or they have a lot of solar and it's either not connected to the grid or the reliability is not there because solar is not always there or there's no battery backup to it, that's someplace that Bitcoin mining is going to thrive. So I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis in the United States, in Canada, in certain parts of Europe. I do think there's certain geographic areas, though, around the world where Bitcoin mining is going to thrive, because Bitcoin mining thrives when there's new generation but not new transmission. So if there's new generation that has to be built and then transmission is 5, 10, or 15 years away, Bitcoin mining is going to thrive. I also think Bitcoin mining is going to thrive in areas where you have zero or no variable cost for power. So I think if we look out 10 or 15 or 20 years, we're going to see Bitcoin mining move with the sun. I think we're going to see it move around the planet as solar becomes cheaper and cheaper to deploy. I think we're going to see Bitcoin mining follow the sun, because Bitcoin miners are going to chase absolutely the cheapest power, and there's nothing cheaper than free. Meaning Bitcoin miners are going to look at electrical infrastructure cost or generation cost just like they look at Bitcoin mining machines, and just like they look at racks or data center infrastructure. Is going to say, look, if I have to put this much capital in the ground, including my solar, including my wind, or including my hydro, whatever the case may be, to have zero variable input cost. And if you can do that, you can thrive as a Bitcoin miner no matter what the hash rate is, or no matter what the hash price is. I do think you're also going to see Bitcoin miners that prepare for the spikes in hash price, but I don't think we're going to, this is me personally, and I've been doing this now for a long time. I don't think we're going to see the spikes in hash price that we saw in the past. I think we saw some outsized returns as a Bitcoin miner. You saw short periods of outsized returns, then you saw mediocre returns for long periods of time. I don't think we're going to see that, but also don't think we're going to see the hash price collapse so much that Bitcoin mining is not supported, because if it does, Bitcoin is not supported. And I think Bitcoin is here to stay. I think the institutional adoption around the planet is now at a case of permanence. So I think from a Bitcoin mining perspective, we're going to see hash price stable, but we're not going to see outsized hash price returns. Bitcoin mining is going to look more like a commodity, and it's going to be who can operate it as a commodity, targeting that 4 to 6 or 7, 8 cent hash price. And I think when we do see those 10, 12, 15 cent hash price spikes, those that are very good are going to be able to take advantage of it. But I think everyone's going to be prepared more so than in the past. Everyone's going to be prepared for that long periods of time where your hash price is 5 or 6 cents. So I think that's where the world of Bitcoin is. And I think AI is going to take Bitcoin mining capacity offline in certain places.
So one last question on the energy nexus.
Yeah.
Bitcoin has been criticized for killing the planet, taking all the energy, and I am seeing energy critics coming for AI. What do you say to them?
I say, you've never met the lobbyist of Microsoft and Google before, but that's not going to be a problem. See, Bitcoin never had those lobbyists.
Yeah.
But let me tell you what, big tech has been doing this for a long time. Big tech, at least in the United States, has controlled Congress for a long time. Bitcoin did not have that. We thought we needed to. And by the way, we did it. We got a president elected, Bitcoin did, which, at least for a period of time, it solved the problem. So I don't think AI is going to have that problem, because they're much better at messaging than Bitcoin's decentralization meant there was no one with a central message, or no one driving, the marketing side of it. AI's got great marketing. So I'm not concerned about that. I'm really not. And fundamentally, I also think that AI is going to actually be good for the energy grid. I really do. Because whenever you have that much capital invested somewhere, it's going to actually be good for their overall utility grid. I mean, if AI infrastructure spending speeds up small modular reactors, we can all check the box and high five and say, hey, that's a great thing. If AI spending speeds up fusion, even by a decade, we should all high five and say, hell yeah, we've done something here. So I think fundamentally that much capital being poured into anything, because by the way, all that stuff is just science, and science just needs money. And science also needs brilliant people, but there's brilliant people if they have the money. Again, if you're funding AI and there's all that capital, it's going to fund science, and science is going to lead to better batteries, better chemistry, better fusion, better small modular reactors. All those things come with new science and new money. So I think all those things ultimately will be a high five. But I think from a marketing perspective and a lobbying perspective, big tech's going to have this thing on lockdown. I mean, they'll probably fund the UFC fight at the White House next summer. Make sure he's covered that way.
That's awesome. What are the bottlenecks for AI data center growth?
Right now, there's a couple different bottlenecks. Energy supplies is probably the largest single bottleneck. If you have an RFS date, a ready for service date, in the next 18 months, there's no shortage of supply of clients that will take your data center. But having an RFS date within 18 months means you already have your substation ready or in place. You already have a power purchase agreement in place. And right now, utilities have overcommitted, and we're seeing the supply of generation, or irradiated generation, is being pushed out. So that's your biggest shortfall. Your second biggest shortfall is going to be supply chain for infrastructure, and that's a global supply chain. However, it is different for different regions. But what we're talking about there is gensets, batteries, those things, CDUs that are used in, cooling devices that are used for GPUs. All those kind of supply chains are maxed out. There are alternatives. You can go down the road of marine infrastructure or airline infrastructure. Most people don't think about marine infrastructure, but you can go and say the same people that supply cruise ships with 400 megawatts of infrastructure can provide you one for your data center. So there's different supply routes you can go to, but all those are getting maxed out right now. The suppliers they don't want to bring on new infrastructure there. So they just want to max out their lines. Now they are increasing their operation time at their manufacturing lines, but they're hesitant to bring on new lines for new infrastructure. When I say it's different geographically, that's just because the utility grid is different geographically. The utility grid in the US versus Europe versus Southeast Asia is different. So there's different supply chains for different ones of those. But that's your big piece. Outside of that, there's definitely a people shortage, particularly in the world of engineers that know how to do the design and do the design work. There's definitely a shortage there. There's a shortage of on the ground electricians. I think our Denton site has like 7,000 on site or some crazy number like that. I mean, we sucked up every electrician in the world that's inside a 4-state area around Texas to finish that thing. So I think there's those kind of shortages that exist. Those are normally short term in nature to a specific geographic area. But, there's lots of shortages on all those places. And I think those are going to exist at least out into 2030 or 2032, 2033. Eventually, I think some of those supply chain shortages and people shortages can be augmented just because, every year you have more kids graduating high school that can go into a trade and they can become electricians. And as long as the electricians are paying what they're paying right now, you'd be foolish to go do anything other than become an electrician right out of high school, because you could retire in 10 years. If you go and work real hard, by the time you're 28, you're done. So I think some of those things will naturally catch up with the demand. But right now there's a lot of shortages everywhere.
Yeah. So you said something really interesting that I want to pull the thread on. You mentioned marine and aviation. Do you mean the actual equipment could be repurposed, or?
Yeah, just the equipment and the manufacturing lines. Like when you think about large boats, large ships, when you have a cruise ship with 5,000 people on it, there's all kinds of electrical infrastructure there. And I'm not saying repurpose a cruise ship. And I'm not saying go buy a used cruise ship and turn it into a data center. I'm just saying that different supply chains and people are trying different means to say, okay, where can I get switch gear, or where can I get the utility infrastructure I need? Where are some different manufacturer lines where I can do that? And by the way, there's all kinds of people all over the world chasing this problem and trying to solve for this problem. In China, they're building out new lines. In India, we're building out new manufacturing lines. In the United States, we're building out new manufacturing lines for transformers as fast as we can. So there's people all over the planet trying to solve for this problem. And each one thinks that, they're going to bring it online and it's going to be enough. But there seems to be, incredible demand for a good period of time here. That's going to keep driving this.
And so in the words of Spock, fascinating. It really is.
Really is.
Can you talk about what the differences in between the infrastructure required, not the power, because the power is sort of similar. How is it infrastructure when you're building out a data center for Bitcoin mining versus AI different, including the costs?
Yeah. So pretty straightforward. As you mentioned, the electrical infrastructure is the same. So generation, transmission lines to the substation, step down transformers at the substation. From the substation, you're going to step down again to a medium voltage transformer and some utility switch gear. All that's the same to that point. At that point, though, things start getting very different. From that point, I can actually plug in a Connex container or just a container with some shelves on it, and that's my Bitcoin mining site right there. At CoreSci, I think we build Bitcoin mining sites at about $500,000 a megawatt if I'm building a building and everything. And those are very efficient. In the world of AI, though, that's my electrical plant. But then once I get inside the building, I actually have more stuff on my electrical infrastructure, including generators and batteries. And then inside the building, outside of my racks, I have network switch gear, I have network gear, I have a lot of fiber, I have a lot of coax, I have a lot of Cat5e, I have a lot of cooling devices in some way, shape, or form. Right now, most of what we're doing is direct liquid cool, which means there's a little plate that sits on top of the GPU, and there's a water solution that has a little chemical in it that moves across that GPU, pulls the heat off, and then goes outside it goes outside the GPU. The water mixture is then cooled and then goes back in again. So that cooling equipment goes in there. So you have a lot of different pieces of equipment around electrical redundancy and around network stuff and around cooling. Now, all that kind of stuff cost about $10 million a megawatt. In some cases, it's gone up a little bit, maybe 11 or $12 million a megawatt.
Yeah.
In the world of Bitcoin mining, the $500,000 tends to be holding pretty good. It's gone up a little bit on the electrical infrastructure just because AI has driven some demand on that electrical infrastructure. The Bitcoin miners have gotten more efficient on the other side. So where the electrical infrastructure has gone up, Bitcoin miners have a lot of times figured out how to get the other stuff cheaper. So a good rule of thumb is a Bitcoin mining costs you $500,000 a megawatt of infrastructure, and AI costs you $10 million a megawatt in infrastructure. And then, of course, the compute loads are very different as far as what they cost. In the world of GPUs, you're still at about $50 million a megawatt for GB200s. Now all that money goes to NVIDIA, and NVIDIA recently has announced that they're going to start leasing stuff. And the reason you're going to do that is because of that $50 million a megawatt, about 40 million of that is margin. And so what NVIDIA has said is, look, we're, the lion's share of the cost of AI data centers. And instead of having Wall Street bankers come in and take their cut and try to provide financing, we can just lease this stuff to our users. And as long as they get their $10 million a megawatt up front, which covers their costs, they can collect the rest of their margin over a period of time through a lease arrangement, which is a brilliant idea. I think it's a way to continue to accelerate because you're asking about bottlenecks. One of the bottlenecks was financing, although I will say, banks are very good at figuring out how to make fees, and they've come in and figured out how to fund a lot of these neo clouds that were harder to fund even a year ago. There's now funding for those kind of clients. But that's where your costs are. And your costs on Bitcoin mining equipment on a per megawatt basis can be all over the place, depending on if you're trying to put the newest, most efficient stuff in, or if you're putting in older stuff. But the cost of capital on a per megawatt basis is significantly lower for Bitcoin mining. Now, the same thing is true, though. The revenue generated on a per megawatt basis is also significantly less in Bitcoin mining than it is in the world of AI, either as a rack-based seller like CoreSci or a GPU as a service kind of provider like a CoreWeave.
Yeah.
Your dollar per megawatt on a revenue basis and a margin basis is a lot higher.
Do you have those numbers, or are they
Not off the top of my
worthwhile?
head, I'll say right now, I can give you on a per kilowatt basis. For a rack space provider right now, you're probably going to, in the US, get between $155 to $165 per kilowatt per month.
Yeah.
If you're looking at a GB200s, last I looked, they were $3 or $4 a GPU hour to rent a GPU. Those numbers are about cut in half for folks that are doing that on a wholesale basis, meaning someone comes in and says, I'm going to rent that GB200 from you for 5 years, 24/7, 365. Those numbers are much lower. And that doesn't give you an idea because I just gave you GPU hour. I gave you kilowatt hour per month. So some other mathematician will have to do all that math to figure out the differences. But the revenue numbers are significantly higher, but your CapEx involved is also significantly higher.
Let's end off on a
Okay.
brighter note. So for those aspiring tech entrepreneurs, what's the most important lesson that you've learned from building and from scaling Core, especially through these like rapid industry shifts?
Wow, most important lesson. Everything changes all the time. Yeah. I would also say something else I've learned, which is read. I spend 2 or 3 hours a day just reading what's going on in the world of AI, what's going on in the world of tech, or trying to become a better prompt engineer myself so that I can take advantage of Grok or ChatGPT a little bit better. So I'd say my biggest lesson is don't be afraid to continue self-learning every single day and do it on your own. With the internet, we have all the data in the world. Now, you do have to filter out what's bullshit and what's useful information. But if you could filter through that information, you could self-learn and self-taught a lot in the world of tech. And all the information. It used to be if you were investments, a broker or somebody was in between you and the data. All the information is available to you, and it's almost available to you instantaneously. I mean, someone at Microsoft, an executive makes a decision, 10 minutes later, it's online what that decision was. So like all that data is available. So don't be afraid to dive into it yourself. And also don't be afraid to change, because just know that fundamentally, unless you are an electrician or you lay brick, your role in life is going to change several times. Now, there's some things, like I said, electricians or bricklayers are probably going to keep their role for a while, or if you're an undersea welder. But a lot of things are going to change fundamentally all the time, especially in the world. AI is going to change things. I can't even tell you. I mean, I look out 5-10 years from now and I go, holy crap, what's the world going to be like? My daughter just turned 25, and I can't tell you what her world's going to be like when she's 35. I'll be retired. I'll be fishing and playing golf. So I'm fine, right? Like me, I'm good. But for the rest of the world, I don't know what it's going to be like. I really don't.
Yeah. I second that. I'm using like 4 or 5 different AIs now. And yes, there's a lot of negative things, but also it's never been easier to be an entrepreneur, to build something, to leverage tools that will allow you to be a solopreneur.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that. I agree with that completely. Actually, solopreneur is a good word for that. And I will say this too. As I kind of poo-pooed on AI because of the data sovereignty, all that kind of stuff. But I put my Star Trek hat on, and I think there's some very real positives for the world that can come from AI, especially in the world of science and medicine and education. I think AI is going to fundamentally change the world of medicine. I think it's going to fundamentally change how fast scientific discovery happens because of what I talked about before. We were creating more data than we could consume, but AI is going to allow us to not only consume but filter and then consume the data we need to consume. And in the world of education, you think about we're fundamentally lacking in teachers, at least in the US, and AI can help augment that. AI can help augment the medical world as far as nurses and doctors. I think when you combine it with robots, AI is going to make the Jetsons future that we've not yet seen. I think AI is going to change that because the mechanics have always been there. It's just always been the software that was the hard part. And I think we're seeing that right now in the world of manufacturing, but I think we're going to see the combination of robots and AI is going to change healthcare for older folks because I think it's going to make people more independent.
Yeah.
You throw in a robot that can help you walk along with self-driving cars, and all of a sudden grandmas are a lot more independent than they were, especially when you throw in self-driving cars.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of very positive things that are going to come. So it's not just a scary world drones killing everybody or Terminator outcome or government controlling everything. There are some very positive things that can happen and are happening, and I'm seeing it every day.
Yeah. I look forward to my own personal data. I, actually, it's really wild how good some of the robots are getting. Like, I don't know if you've seen some of the ones that are doing martial arts or I mean, I look at some of these videos and they're literally beating up robots, right? Because they're trying to see how fast they can respond. But they're to the point where they get knocked down, they can like instantly jump back up. And it's just so impressive.
The agility and the learning, it's really crazy. And we're seeing it first in manufacturing, but we're going to see it kind of across lots of space. So again, I think the intersection of robotics and AI is going to have another fundamental shift in the way humanity exists. I don't know whether it'd be good. It could be Terminator, but it also could be Star Trek. I don't know
Yeah.
I don't know which outcome it'll be. So one of two.
It's hard enough to pay attention to what's happening in Bitcoin. I'm trying to also keep an eye on what's happening in AI, what's happening in robotics. And it's like, I need 3 megs.
Yeah, no kidding. It's actually it's fascinating the world we live in right now.
Yeah. So, Russell, where can people find you?
CoreScientific.com. I'm still there for the time being. We just announced that I think the CoreWeave vote will be in the month of October, so I don't know. It might be at CoreWeave.com after that. But for right now, I'm still at Core Scientific. It's just Russell Cann. My email is russell@CoreScientific.com because I was there when the email system was set up. I was only Russell at the time. But yeah, I'm online all the time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was super enlightening.
All right. Thanks, Mags. I appreciate the interview.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Magsplaining. Make sure you subscribe to the show so you don't miss any new episodes. And if you turn on the notifications or if you leave a positive review, it can really help my show reach new listeners. This show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Nothing should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always DYOR. Do your own research. Catch you next time.